Hi, third grade. Welcome back for chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball. Yesterday, we met Mr. O'Grady, who is going to be teaching the students an Irish dance during PE class, and I can't wait to see what happens next. So we'll go ahead and get started. Chapter 4 is called Bowling for Dancers. Eddie watched his friends act like grasshoppers on a trampoline. There's no way I'm going to hop around like that, he muttered while sneaking behind the bleachers. There, waiting for Eddie, were enough basketballs to make 30 seals happy. The balls were in two huge string bags. Eddie jerked on the strings and turned the balls loose. With only a little help from Eddie, they started rolling straight for the dancers and Mr. O'Grady. Bowling for dancers, Eddie giggled as he waited for the kids to start falling. But the balls never reached their targets. Instead, they slowed down and stopped. Eddie scratched his head. What's going on? Eddie didn't notice Mr. O'Grady reaching deep into his marble bag as the balls started rolling again. Only this time they were headed straight for Eddie. Eddie stepped away from the rolling balls, but they were like magnets. The more he high stepped, the more the balls bumped against his feet. I'm glad to see you are joining our happy jig. Mr. O'Grady's voice suddenly came from behind him. Eddie jumped and banged into the bleachers. He rubbed his head and stuttered, No, dancing's for girls. To dance is to live, Mr. O'Grady smiled. My people always are dancing. 'Tis the men that love it the most. Eddie rolled his eyes. Then the men are sissies. The sound of Mr. O'Grady's laughter matched the music from the record player. 'Tis nothing wrong with a liking a good time. Here's what happened. A scene from that story. Eddie couldn't argue with that. Mr. O'Grady's eyes crinkled with laughter as he continued. Dancing is one of three ways we folk have fun. What are the other two ways? Eddie asked as he kicked a basketball out of his way. Mr. O'Grady pulled open his drawstring pouch. A little dancing and a few more gems in our pouches make us happy as a robin in spring. Eddie stared at the sparkling stones of different colors in the pouch. Where did you get those? He asked. That's what I'm a-telling you. Mr. O'Grady laughed as he pulled out a stone the color of a cherry. He rubbed it gently with his thumb. The folk like to collect stones from around the world. Eddie stared at the bright gem. Jewelry is for sissies, too, Eddie finally said. What's the third thing you do to have fun? "'Tis the favorite pastime of the folk," Mr. O'Grady whispered, "but a thing the monsters from Transylvania cannot stand." Eddie jerked to attention. What do you know about Transylvania? I know they cannot stand the tricks of the folk, Mr. O'Grady said. But Mrs. Jeepers is from Transylvanian Alps, Eddie blurted. Then he wished he'd kept his mouth shut because Mr. O'Grady's face grew as red as his sweatsuit. This teacher of yours? Would she have the hair the color of the sunrise and be a serious sort who allows no fun-loving shenanigans? Boy, that's for sure, Eddie agreed. And would she be wearing a brooch the color of spring grass? Mr. O'Grady asked. Eddie's eyes got big as he nodded. So she is here. Mr. O'Grady chuckled as he slid the red stone into his pouch and jerked the string tight. Mr. O'Grady grabbed one of the basketballs and twirled away from Eddie. Without another word, he zigzagged his way through the dancing third graders to the record player. The screech of the needle across the record brought the dancers to a halt. What's the matter? Liza asked. Weren't we doing the dance right? Mr. O'Grady smiled. You dance like butterflies in a field of daisies, but our friend Eddie seems to be a wanting to play with basketballs instead. All the kids glared at Eddie, who was still trying to kick away the basketballs. But I was having fun dancing, Liza whined. Melody nodded her head. Eddie ruins everything. Mr. O'Grady bounced the ball. Basketball is a grand way to be having fun, too. Why, back home, they call me Magic O'Grady on the court. Let me be showing you a few tricks. The third graders watched Mr. O'Grady dribble the ball down the center of the court. His little pouch jingled with each step. Oh, that's nothing, Eddie sneered as Mr. O'Grady went by. My kid's sister could do that with her eyes closed. Mr. O'Grady stopped in the middle of the court just long enough to reach into his little pouch. Suddenly, the ball became an orange blur as Mr. O'Grady whizzed the ball between his legs and around his back. The kids gasped as the little man in the red suit twirled the ball on the tip of one finger. In the next second, he threw the ball all the way down the court. As the ball swished through the net without touching the rim, Mr. O'Grady danced a little jig. All right, Howie clapped and poked Eddie in the ribs. Eddie watched as the third graders of Bailey Elementary crowded around the short gym teacher, and then he shrugged. We'll just see how long his Irish luck lasts. Chapter 5, Green Blood. You'd think we could at least cut out some green shamrocks, Liza complained at the lunch table. Maybe we will this afternoon, Melody suggested as she tore open her sandwich bag. No, Eddie shook his head. Mrs. Jeepers doesn't want to have anything to do with St. Patrick's Day, all because she hates leprechauns. What's to hate? Howie asked. They're just make-believe creatures. Yeah, Liza agreed. They're cute, too. Not according to Mrs. Jeepers, Carrie broke in. From listening to her, you'd think leprechauns were responsible for the Black Plague, Eddie said in between bites of an apple. She must know something about leprechauns that we don't know, Melody said. I'll ask my grandmother to tell me about St. Patrick's Day and leprechauns, Howie thought out loud. She's visiting this week, and she was born in Ireland. Melody giggled. I bet you have green blood. You're probably part leprechaun. Just because somebody's from Ireland doesn't mean they're a leprechaun, Howie said. If that was true, Mr. O'Grady would be a leprechaun. Well, he is short, Melody pointed out. And he does carry a pouch, Liza said. I bet it's full of gold. That's not a pouch for gold, Eddie interrupted. All his friends turned to look at him. How do you know? Melody asked. Eddie shrugged. Because she showed me. What's in it? Howie asked. Just a bunch of stupid stones, Eddie said as he bit into his chocolate fudge brownie. He collects them. Melody gasped. He must be a leprechaun. He's from Ireland. He's short, and he's got a treasure. He probably has a pot of gold hidden somewhere. What are you talking about? There's no such thing as leprechauns. Eddie sounded more sure than he felt. Howie shrugged. Maybe not, but Mr. O'Grady is no regular coach. I think we better watch out, he said quietly. Mr. O'Grady is strange. Did you notice how he never looks straight into your eyes? Yeah, Melody agreed. He looks at your nose instead. He may be short, Liza said, and he may be from Ireland, but I'm pretty sure leprechauns don't play basketball. Everyone burst out laughing, but they grew silent when Mrs. Jeepers walked over to their table. Did I hear the word leprechaun? She demanded. No, ma'am, Eddie lied. We were just talking about the new coach, Melody told her. Liza spoke up. His name is Mr. O'Grady, and he's from Ireland. Isn't that neat? Mrs. Jeepers' face went ghostly pale and her eyes flashed. Did you say Ireland? Liza nodded. He loves to dance, so he taught us an Irish jig. You'll really like him. Mrs. Jeepers' green eyes flashed. I have no desire to meet anyone from Ireland. But he's so much fun, Liza said. And he collects different kinds of stones. He even showed them to Eddie. Shh, Howie hissed. But it was too late. Mrs. Jeepers touched her brooch. So he has found me. I did not think it would be so soon. With that, Mrs. Jeepers hurried away from the table and out of the cafeteria. The kids looked at each other. Eddie finally broke the silence. What did she mean by that? Howie shook his head. I'm not sure, but I think there's going to be trouble. Chapter 6, last one today. Stairway to the Emerald Isle. That afternoon, the four kids met under the oak tree. I wonder why Mrs. Jeepers acted so strange when we told her about Mr. O'Grady, Melody asked. Maybe he's her long-lost husband, Liza said wistfully. But she acted scared, Eddie reminded them. Maybe her long-lost husband is an axe murderer, Melody giggled nervously. But Mrs. Jeepers said her husband was dead, Howie pointed out. Maybe Mr. O'Grady's with the Irish CIA, Melody suggested. Mrs. Jeepers might be an international jewel thief. Maybe Mr. O'Grady really is a leprechaun, Liza said softly. You know, Mrs. Jeepers doesn't like them. Why don't you guys come home with me for a few moments? Howie suggested. My grandmother knows all about Ireland. I'm sure she can tell us about leprechauns. She'll know why Mrs. Jeepers is afraid of them. I guess it'd be okay. Just for a minute, Melody said. Everyone else nodded and headed toward Howie's house. It didn't take long for the four friends to walk the 3 blocks. They dumped their book bags in the front hall and found Howie's grandmother in the family room, reading the newspaper. Her curly gray hair danced around her head and her eyes sparkled like blue sapphires. Well, Howie, his grandmother smiled and put down her newspaper. You look to be bringing half the school home with you. Howie introduced Melody, Liza, and Eddie. He was barely finished when Eddie blurted, We need to know about leprechauns. Howie's grandmother's smile faded, but just for a moment. So, St. Patrick's Day has you a-wondering about the little fairy folk. 'Tis a good thing to talk about on this fine day. His grandmother's voice tinkled with the same accent as Mr. O'Grady's. Treat yourselves to some cookies and I'll be a-telling you some leprechaun tales. The kids helped themselves to a handful of cookies from the kitchen and then settled down to listen. Once upon a time in Ireland, Howie's grandmother began. No, Grandma, Howie interrupted. We have to have the true story of leprechauns. Melody nodded. Our teacher wouldn't tell us a thing. Mrs. Jeepers acted very strange today, Howie explained. She's from Romania, and she won't even talk about leprechauns. Howie's grandmother frowned. Saints preserve us, she said quietly. Leprechauns are a most peculiar fairy folk. Most people don't know the true history of their race. But they're just cute little men who wear green and hide pots of gold at the end of rainbows, Liza said. Truth is a rainbow doesn't only lead to a pot of gold, Howie's grandmother whispered. A rainbow is also a leprechaun stairway to the Emerald Isle. What's the Emerald Isle? Melody asked. 'Tis another name for Ireland, Howie's grandmother explained. Settle back and I'll be a-telling you the true story of the wee folk. The four friends sat on the floor and peered up at the old woman. She spoke so quietly they had to lean forward to hear. We'll hear the true story of the wee folk tomorrow.